if France refused to agree to release those reserves, obviously that would make it impossible to change the currency. People were frustrated that the French hadn't completely solved the problem, and those new military regimes were able to tap into that frustration. When Macron first came in as president, his long-term plan, he always made clear that he thought that over time the French military presence should be reduced. The Senegalese president basically, he complimented President Macron for admitting this had been a massacre. He also made that remark that the French will have found much more difficult to cope with, that he felt it was time that the French military bases ended.
Hello and welcome to today's edition of Unpopular Opinion podcast. In this episode, we are not just having a conversation, we are confronting Africa's development and colonial legacy. Colonialism in Africa did not just end as a result of African countries receiving piece of papers from their colonial masters. It transformed into language, politics, economic relations. And nowhere is clearer for this than Francophone West Africa, where France still casts a long shadow. My guest is Mr. Paul Melly. He is a leading scholar on Francophone West African politics, development, and colonial history. In this episode, we are going to be looking at the role of France, both past and present, from the famous Franc CFA agreement to military presence in the region, from politics to language. Mr. Paul Melly, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. For a start, do you think Francophone West African countries are truly independent, considering the PAC agreement between the former colonies and France?
Yes, I do think they're truly independent, and it would be a discredit to West Africans, West African people, West African societies, and their states, their governments, to suggest that they're not independent. But I think the relationship between France and the countries over which it used to be the colonial ruler, and of course that's very different from the countries in Central Africa like Democratic Republic of Congo that were colonies of Belgium, but the countries which were French colonies, their relationship with France is rather different from the relationship between the former Belgian colonies and Belgium, and certainly between the relationship between countries, for example, such as Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and the Gambia, and the UK, which used to be those countries' colonial power. But I don't think it would be fair to say that the Francophone African countries are not truly independent. The structures and arrangements that they are in, and they vary quite significantly between some countries and others, are arrangements that they have chosen to be in or to remain in. And the relationship that they have with France, although it is at the moment a subject of huge controversy and a lot of criticism among many people, particularly young Francophone West Africans in the cities of the region, is one that is quite complicated, but ultimately one where their countries do have a choice. So I think that applies whether it's to the military sphere or the economic sphere, or, for example, education and the very dense web of cultural and familial and technical connections across a whole range of areas. And in that sense, you can again make some parallels with the relationship, for example, between, say, Nigeria and the UK. There's a big Nigerian population in the UK. There are many Nigerians who have connections in the UK, and many Nigerian institutions whose structures and operating rules and the various technical things they use are have roots, if you like, or connections with aspects of the British system, and it's true with the French-speaking countries and their relationship with France. But they do have a choice. How they choose to exercise that choice is obviously shaped by lots of different pressures that they face, but they have a real choice.
Okay, thank you very much. Some Pan-Africanists or young people around West Africa argue that their countries are not independent, considering the historical Parc Agreement, where part of the national reserves are being kept in France, as well as the Franc CFA agreement is also being printed in Lyon, as well as the military presence in their countries. They do ultimately feel that these are agreements that prop up corrupt leaders, and these corrupt leaders, or these are systems that gave birth to corrupt leaders supported by France. So as a result, the system of colonialism continues in another form. What can you say about that?
Well, I think you touch on a very important point, because there is deep, deep disillusion among many young West Africans, certainly in the Francophone countries, with their leaderships. And they, as a result, it creates a situation where they perceive that those structures, if you like, which are seen as managed by the relationship between their governments and the government in France, are resented. They're seen as a continuation, if you like, a perpetuation of structures that had their origins in the colonial period, and that's certainly true. But I think there are a couple of really important points to make here. That firstly, those countries' governments have the choice in the specific example of the currency, which we can look at in a bit more detail in a moment. But those countries' governments actually have the free choice to either withdraw from that currency arrangement or completely change it if they wish. Now, they may decide not to, and that could be for economic policy reasons, or it could be, as you imply, for reasons to protect, if you like, their particular interests. But it isn't actually the French government that is requiring them to stay in that currency arrangement, and there are countries that have left it in the past. And so I think more broadly, though, that there's a real challenge, and it applies to all outside countries with relations with West Africa at the moment, which is that there's a lot of widespread popular frustration with the governing class in general, and that's certainly true in Francophone countries. It's not for me to judge for Anglophone or Portuguese-speaking countries. I'm not really well placed to judge, but I would say that when I travel in the region, there's, particularly among younger people, there's a deep, deep disillusion with their leaders generally, and not just the individual presidents and the political regimes, but, if you like, the sort of governing class around those leaderships in most countries. And the problem that presents for an outside country, it's true for France, but it's actually true more generally for, it could be the UK, it could be the European Union, it could be the US, is that, of course, foreign governments tend to deal with African governments. When countries are dealing with each other, it's at the level of political leaders. And so, for example, the European Union a few years ago decided to adopt a new partnership philosophy in its relations with African countries. But of course, the EU is a collection of states. And so the Africans that it was then dealing in partnership with and making a special effort to ensure that decisions were shared and not imposed from outside, but still the African partner in that relationship, or African partners, were of course governments. So if if there's a loss of faith, frustration among ordinary West Africans, or the West African citizens, with the regimes, with the governments that are ruling their countries, then of course that poses a problem. But if an outside actor seeks to try an alternative route to, as it were, reach across and engage, then that can sometimes be criticized. And an interesting example is actually the French president, Emmanuel Macron, a few years ago, decided that France every few years there's a summit between France and African countries. And of course, normally, sometimes it's in Africa, sometimes it's in France. Next year it will be in Kenya, for example. But normally it's organized, it's a meeting of government leaders. But the last meeting that was hosted by France, the French government decided to focus on inviting young people, cultural figures, sports figures. They invited the Cameroonian intellectual and writer Achille Mbembe to put together the program. So it was focused on civil society, cultural figures, youth actors, and they didn't invite African heads of state. So it was a different type of contact, and that some of the discussions were certainly interesting, but there were also complaints from people in, shall we say, traditional world of government in Africa, people saying, well, hang on, isn't this disrespectful? Why have you not invited us, etc., etc. So it's a kind of it's quite a difficult relationship to reshape and overhaul. And it's just one small example of the challenges that Macron, as the current French president, has faced in his efforts. He has actually tried to modernize and to overhaul the relationship between France and its former, the countries that used to be colonies under French rule in Africa. But it's a task that's beset with a lot of complexity and huge sensitivities. And again, the currency relationship. Back in 2017, just after he had become president, he went to Burkina Faso and he made a speech where he announced that France would accept whatever reform of the CFA franc the African governments decided, if they wished to reform it, if they wished to change the system. But, of course, reforming a currency, replacing a currency, or creating a new currency, such as the planned 𝐒𝐄 currency that's been under discussion for the ECOWAS countries, that's actually quite difficult. In technical terms, it's a really big, difficult economic challenge. And up to now,
Sorry for
the West African
you know,
countries that
before we go to the echo, I just wanted to bring you something. That is you talked about the countries in West Africa with the Franc CFA agreement. We know that Guinea as a country left the agreement in 1958. And besides that, I'm not sure of any other country that left that agreement. And, how could you be able to to change the agreement if significant portion of your national reserves is being kept in another person's country, controlled by the finance minister or by their government? How do you think can this be possible?
it wouldn't, if that country, and obviously it's France, and there is an account in Paris, a government bank account where these reserves can be deposited, that if France refused to agree to release those reserves, obviously that would make it impossible to change the currency. But in fact, there've been a couple of, I think 3 countries have left at various stages. So Guinea, as you said, left in 1958. then later on, Mauritania left. And then later on, Mali left. Now, Mauritania and Mali left in much easier conditions. Guinea, the discussion around Guinean independence became very conflictual between Guinea and France, the Guinean leaders, Sékou Touré, and the French. And in effect, Guinea just demanded its independence and walked away. But the withdrawal of Mauritania and Mali from the CFA franc system came much later, many years later, and in a much easier political climate. And actually, the Malians, after a period, then decided to go back. So they didn't stay out of the system for very long. No, there has been a reform since, much more recently, since that announcement by Macron back in 2017. The president of Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara, was asked by the leaders of the other countries in the West African CFA franc bloc. So there are 8 countries in the bloc, and then there's a separate 6-country CFA franc bloc in Central Africa. So the West African leaders, they asked Ouattara, because he used to be deputy managing director of the IMF, and he's respected for his economic strengths, if you like, if he could explore the reform options. And a first phase of reforms was introduced at the end of 2019, and that was an agreement which basically said that there would be no longer any requirement for the member countries to put their money, their reserves, part of their reserves, in this bank account in Paris. So that requirement was ended, but there's a deeper point about the CFA, which is that if you want to move to a new currency, if you are any country in the world, but particularly if you're a relatively lower income developing country, you need obviously to have some reserves that international investors, international currency markets will respect and will underpin your currency. Just any country has to do that. And under the current arrangement, following that change in 2019, any of the member countries, they could choose to place their reserves in a range of places. So the door is open for change, but there is another factor which is complicating the currency reform, which is the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, and the euro is obviously a very strong currency, and in the Eurozone, the European Central Bank has a very tough policy which keeps inflation very low. So the inflation rate in a typical Francophone African country, in Côte d'Ivoire or Senegal, or even in the Sahel countries with the difficulties they face, generally the inflation rate, you're talking a very few percent, often low single figures. And that obviously is helpful for consumers, but the people who benefit most from it are the urban consumers, and particularly those better off people living in the cities who have the chance to make savings and who find it, they're the people who are buying the most imported consumer goods. Because if you have a strong currency and you have low inflation, you can bring in your products from abroad. And the people who are benefiting less from that are, of course, the poorer rural populations and poorer people more generally, because they don't have much money to buy imported goods anyway. So they have less interest, and particularly people in the countryside who are growing their own food. And so there are leading intellectuals, prominent economists, for example, in the CFA franc zone, who there's a very highly respected economist, for example, called 𝐵𝐾𝐒 from Togo, and he has pointed out that the current system particularly benefits, if you like, higher income urban West Africans. And of course, those are the people who have the biggest voice in the political system and in government policy. And so that, if you like, is a brake on the possibility of making reform. So it's not a very easy sell to it sounds easy to get rid of the currency system, but actually it's technically quite complicated, but it's also politically difficult because you have to persuade the vocal and influential urban better off people, the political upper and middle class, that they should accept the shift to a new currency or the break with the old system.
I want us to look at another aspect of this discussion that has to do with security. The French-led international response to Islamist insurgency in the Sahel has faced significant criticism from all walks of life across that region. Do you think how has the French military presence, influenced security across West Africa, especially with many countries now kicking the French out of their countries?
Well, I think you have to make a difference between two types of country. There are several countries, particularly Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, and Chad, where the French had for many years, and basically since independence, they had retained military bases. And in the early days, in some cases, those, and even in more recent years, in the case of Chad, those bases were seen, if you like, to some extent as a bit of a protection for the regime. So Idriss Déby, the former Chadian authoritarian president, father of the current president, I think on at least two occasions, he asked the French to intervene when he was facing a domestic rebellion. But those are places where the French forces, their main job was just to maintain a long-term base, a permanent presence. And then you have the situation in the Sahel countries, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and in Niger. That's quite different because the French troops were not, after independence, they left those countries, basically. Those countries did not have a continuing French presence, but when the security crisis started getting worse in the Sahel, that is when their government asked the French to come back. So Burkina Faso agreed to have a small base of French special forces outside Ouagadougou, very low profile, just about 300 or 400 troops, as a sort of backup because it was worried about the regional security situation. But the really significant one, and the thing that was very high profile, came in early 2013 when jihadists had taken over the whole of the north of Mali and they were starting to push south. And the Malian government was very worried that the jihadists could, within a few days, reach Bamako and basically take over Mali. And so the interim president of the country called President François Hollande, who was the president of France at the time, and asked him to send French troops urgently to help. So that's what started the big French presence across the Sahel, which at its peak reached about 6,000 troops, 5,500, 6,000 troops, something like that. And so that was a completely different situation. And what made it particularly difficult was, at least I think, one of the factors was that in the Sahel countries, people had got used to the fact that there weren't any French troops. The French military weren't part of the scenery. And then they were called in an emergency, and then that presence got transformed because it was very difficult to tackle the jihadists. And after all, we know, again, look at the example of Boko Haram and ISWAP in northeast Nigeria. These security problems are not easily resolved, even if you have a lot of military resources. And so, although the French troops, in cooperation with troops from other West African countries, managed to quite quickly liberate the cities in northern Mali, like Timbuktu and Gao, actually bringing an end to the jihadist group's activities proved very difficult. And so President Hollande decided that the presence would remain for the medium term in Mali. And then a backup base was set up in Niger to support the Mali operation. And then eventually, when the French pulled out of Mali, the president of Niger, President Bazoum, asked the French to help him because his country, he felt the part of Niger around Niamey, the Niger capital, is not far from the Mali border, and he felt very exposed. In Niger, there were a lot of jihadist attacks across the border, so he asked the French to keep a permanent garrison's presence there, and also some European Union from other EU countries. So this was a sort of something that really happened over the last 10 years. And it's, at one level, you look at the equipment the French had, the Mirage jets and the armored vehicles, and they were supported by US satellite surveillance and so on. And you say, why couldn't they tackle the jihadists? But again, if you make a parallel with Afghanistan, for example, there was a huge international force, far more troops than the French ever had in the Sahel, in Afghanistan, which is only about the size of one Sahelian country. And yet Afghanistan, as we know, the Taliban situation proved impossible in the end to control. So I don't think it was probably ever likely that the French through pure military force could defeat the jihadists, although they did lots of operations where they attacked groups of militants or they killed prominent militant leaders. The problem is huge and complex, and it relates to it overlaps with deep development problems, deep problems of political frustration and alienation in parts of those countries. Of course, you have tensions. It's also against a background where there are tensions between settled farming communities and livestock herders, again, such as you get in the Middle Belt in Nigeria and in other parts of the continent. It's not a very easy situation to manage, and it's completely unsurprising that the French couldn't resolve it. And now, of course, with the military takeovers in the Sahel, those new military regimes, people were frustrated that the French hadn't completely solved the problem. And those new military regimes were able to tap into that frustration. And there's also been more that played into the wider, I think, general alienation, if you like, with not both political elites, but also with the French connection to political elites across the region more widely. And that's what's led the other countries, so Chad and Senegal, to ask the French to leave completely, because politically they could see that that would be popular. And in the case of Senegal, it was also completely logical. The Senegalese president, President Faye, pointed out there wasn't actually any need for the French to be there at all. Senegal has a strong military. It's a politically stable, democratic country. It had just held a very successful series of democratic elections last year, changing both the president and then later on the parliament. There was no real reason why the only reason the French were still there was because the issue hadn't been raised by previous Senegalese governments, if you like. It hadn't been put on the table. And it's interesting that even Côte d'Ivoire, where President Ouattara is a very close ally of France, he very quickly announced at the beginning, in his speech to mark the new year, 2025, that he'd reached agreement with the French for their presence to be drastically reduced to just a small training team who will work alongside the Ivorian military. And the same in Gabon, again, a country whose government remains very close to France. The French presence is going to be perhaps 100 French military trainers who will work alongside the Gabonese, because the governments in those coastal countries could see that what had happened in the Sahel showed them, if you like, that there wasn't really any popular support for a strong French military presence to be there. I mean, the paradox or the irony is that when Macron first came in as president, his long-term plan, he always made clear that he thought that over time the French military presence should be reduced. But through a combination of the way events evolved, but also because sometimes he's made some very arrogant and tactless diplomatic remarks in public, that process accelerated very dramatically. But I think it's going to take a little time, but little by little, everyone will get used to this new situation that no, the French military presence is either non-existent or else they just have small training operations, not unlike those that, for example, the British have sometimes had in Nigeria or the Americans have sometimes had in some West African countries. And of course there are other training partners as well who are sometimes invited in by African governments. So that's the evolution is probably a very healthy one, and may also help to shift the mindset, if you like, because it's been shown that when African governments asked the French to leave, they did leave. So that's obviously better. It creates a more, should we say, a more mature and more balanced relationship.
Okay. Thank you so much for that lengthy explanation. A lot of young people believe that the French troops were in the Sahel to protect their own personal interests based on natural resources exploitation. And considering the historical events that happened in Guinea before the independence, the French government went in to destroy some of the institutions that they had built in Guinea. So they actually do believe that many of these things that are going on today are as a result of in the same light. So do you think what is the main reason behind the young people revolt against the French and against their own government, leading to the failure of democracy in many West African countries with respect to Francophone West Africa?
Well, I think it's partly the result of sometimes how France has behaved, and it's not just France. After all, let's be clear. We know that there are in other parts of Africa there are some very authoritarian governments, for example, that the British have been very close to, indeed remain close to. And yet, interestingly, that hasn't produced the same popular anger, even though the British government has been very closely allied with and maintained very friendly relations with some governments that are completely undemocratic. It hasn't produced the same kickback, if you like. I think it's also because the world has changed. Everything is, after all, we're doing a podcast. Podcast didn't even exist 10 years ago. Satellite TV is only, 25 years old? The internet, for practical purposes, most people didn't have internet access 30 years ago, even 20 years ago. It was limited to some places. So I think that means everybody is asking many more questions. People have access to much more information, but they can also see things. And of course, they can also see all the stuff that goes out on social media, some of which is true, some of which is not, and a lot of debates, different arguments. So, for example, there are a couple of figures. There's a guy called Kémi Séba. There's somebody called Nathalie Yam. They're very prominent in Francophone Africa as advocates, if you like, of a vigorous anti-French nationalism. Now, if we went back 20 or 30 years, their views would simply, those channels of communication for their views to circulate weren't there, not in the same way. And so it was much harder for messages, alternative narratives, alternative views to surface. But I think there's also, it's fair to say, that there is a degree of frustration among many people, because they can see in their own societies that same questioning, that same mass of information and exposure that allows them to criticize and question what an outside actor like France may be doing, also means that they can pose those questions about their own countries. Effectively, censorship has more or less collapsed. We can see that, for example, there's an authoritarian government in Mali, and yet everybody knows that there have been protests in recent weeks over democracy and the Malian government's attempt to shut down political parties. And that information is out there. Anyone can read it on the internet. It's visible. The insecurity that are in parts, there are some communities, for example, that have recently been attacked, are under siege from jihadist groups, or are being persecuted, or are suffering human rights abuses from one side or the other. They've actually been putting videos out on the internet from deep in rural parts of the Sahel. Now, of course, 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't, all of this open information space wasn't there in the same way at all. And so that means that popular frustration, people's frustrations with the shortcomings of their own governments, their own leaders, whether it's in public services, whether it's to do with corruption, whether it's to do with the pace of development or whatever, all that is much more easily expressed, if you like. And I think also that means, though, that it sometimes critiques about the motivations for why a particular actor, or in this case the French as an outside power, are doing something. Sometimes it also means that information that may not be perhaps the most rational explanation can get out there, and you can see it in the Sahel that there are contrasting situations actually between the countries. So in Niger, it is certainly true. Niger was an important supplier of uranium for the French nuclear industry. And you can certainly make a significant argument that France had a strategic interest in Niger because the French energy sector is based on nuclear power, and Niger is one of the three main suppliers of uranium to France, or has been until the current regime took over. But actually, the main valuable natural resources in Burkina Faso and in Mali is gold. And actually, the gold mining sector in those countries is completely dominated by the British, the Canadians, the South Africans, the Australians, the Americans, the Russians. French companies, France has almost no involvement in the gold mining sector at all. There isn't really an economic interest for the French presence there. But France has other national interest reasons why it wanted to remain in the Sahel, which are powerful ones, but they're not particularly to do with natural resources. I think there's a very simple thing that people tend to forget. After all, you only have to look at the map to see that the western half of Africa is Europe's next door neighbor. And so France, actually like many other European countries, but perhaps the French have focused on this more than others, they see a big national interest in West Africa's stability. Because I remember being at a meeting many years ago where an American journalist asked the French Minister for Development at the time, "So why are you so bothered about Africa?" And he said to the American journalist, "Well, if Africa falls into crisis, for you just look at it across the Atlantic. But if Africa falls into crisis, we feel the problems because we are the continent right next door." So I think it's less about business interests. And if you look at the hard figures of trade and finance, the West Africa, Francophone West Africa, is a very tiny proportion of French international trade. But it's a much broader, simpler rationale that if West Africa falls into instability and crisis, that has big implications for Europe. And there is also a diplomatic rationale in that France has seen the support of African countries as a support to its international profile, votes at the United Nations, all that kind of thing. But I think that its resources actually aren't it. The resource question, you could actually say, France's biggest key priority economic partner in Africa is Nigeria. Côte d'Ivoire, I think, is only number 4 on the list after Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are all more important for the French economy than Côte d'Ivoire. And many of the smaller Francophone countries, they're not really big economic partners, but there is this wider rationale.
To our listeners, if you are just joining us, I'd like to encourage you to please support our broadcast. If you want to see us in better studio, if you want to see us in quality studio, if you want to see us doing live interview with our guests, I want you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, comment, share, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members to also be a guest. You can also recommend individuals to us who you think are doing remarkable works in their fields of studies or in their research or in their professional life when it comes to Africa. We will try our best to bring them to this platform to discuss the critical roles they are playing or their research they've made. Mr. Paul, we are almost coming to an end of this edition. We have about 15 minutes. to go. I want to ask you, what do you think African countries get it wrong with their relations with France, and where do you think they get it right with respect to their relations with France?
I suppose the criticism wouldn't be a criticism of individual policies, though I'm sure we could debate in detail this or that policy. But I think it is it's quite good for if African countries say, yes, these are the terms of our relationship. We want to, and and I think there's a French word, s'assumer, which means you take public responsibility, if you like, for something. So I think if there is a bit of a tendency to and I think the currency issue is a good example. So of course all this criticism and debate is going on, and yet, as I mentioned, there are some quite complicated, serious reasons why the currency change hasn't happened yet. But what we haven't seen is African governments getting up and saying, look, the reasons why we haven't changed the currency system so far are X, Y, and Z. Or we are talking to France about changing the currency system, but so far we have this or that technical factor that, so I think African governments, it's they the relationship is it becomes a bit easier to manage, if you like, once they kind of stand up for why they're making their case. Now, obviously, in the case of the Sahel countries, it's quite complicated because this has been combined with a big political change internally and a shift to authoritarian rule, with no elections now for, I think, all three Central Sahel regimes have said they're not going to have any. It's going to be military rule for at least another 5 years and possibly longer. So that's that creates a difficult, but they've certainly stood up for the stance they're adopting, whatever whatever the French or any other outside person might think of it. But I think it's the most important dimension is really when West African country governments are more self-confident about the way they position themselves. And I think a good example actually is the situation with Senegal last year. So in the same week that the Senegalese president said he saw no reason to for French troops to remain in Senegal, so which was if you like, taking that public stance very firmly, he also actually, at the same time, complimented President Macron for the fact that Macron has basically there's an alleged massacre which took place in 1944, where some French the French colonial authorities, there was a shootout with some French African soldiers, West African soldiers, who were in the French army, and it's thought this was a massacre. And President Macron was the first French leader ever to publicly say that a massacre had taken place. And this was a big deal. And the Senegalese president basically said in public, he complimented President Macron for admitting, for saying that this had been a massacre. And at the same time, he also made that remark that the French would have found much more difficult to cope with, that he felt it was time that the French military bases ended. So, in other words, he was fronting up for his position. So I think that's an example of the way to move forward. And it also touches on a couple of things which may over time help the evolution of the relationship, though the results are not likely to come very quickly, which is that under the current French government, a series of historical inquiries have been set up. In the case of Senegal, it's a Senegalese inquiry that the French have endorsed. But in the case of Cameroon, it's a joint Cameroonian-French inquiry. Then there's been a French inquiry in Algeria, and there's been an inquiry in Rwanda, and there's now going to be an inquiry in Madagascar. And in each case, these are inquiries by historians where the French government has either launched the process or endorsed the process to look at some of the very violent acts that happened, particularly in the colonial period, very often during the period of the independence wars, or either just before or after independence. And so it's been a readiness, if you like, to face up to difficult history. And this is quite interesting because it's something that other colonial powers have actually not yet done. So at the moment, because Macron is not popular in Africa, he's a very contentious figure, he's unlikely to get much personal credit for it in the short term. But over time, as this information is, as it were, put out there, if you like, and people can see the hard, difficult historical truths, that's something that could begin to heal some of these wounds. And Guinea, which, as you mentioned, had a very difficult moment of independence, that might also be a period. I don't think there was armed violence there, but obviously the events around independence in Guinea were very contentious. And an independent historical inquiry, that might be another obvious case, if you like, a situation where, face it, getting academics, African academics, French academics working together to basically get all the information out there, to open up the archives, could help. Another gesture which is much easier to do, but again, which not all other countries have done, he's instigated a policy of cultural return. So the Benin bronzes, which are, of course, for Nigeria, such a hot issue, there are also Benin bronzes, Benin cultural artifacts to the Republic of Benin. And a number of those in French museums have already been sent back, and artifacts have been returned to Madagascar and to Senegal, and a very important drum is about to go back to Côte d'Ivoire. So these small gestures will help. But I think the relationship between West Africa and France, a lot of things need to change and a lot of things are evolving, but it is also quite deeply rooted, and it goes back a very long way. And for example, in the French political system, something that was slightly different from the British political system was that during the colonial era, people from quite an early stage, those people who were in the educated West African middle class, had the vote and political rights, and they were treated as French citizens. Now, decades later, it's caused complications because of this, the more difficult process of, if you like, separating African national identity from French national identity. But at the moment of independence, some of the people who became independence leaders, they had actually, President Houphouët-Boigny, the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, for example, he'd actually been a minister in the French government. And in Senegal, the Senegalese elected the first black Senegalese member of parliament for Dakar, was elected in 1914, 1-4, before the First World War. And he too later became a minister in the French government. So those roots, those partnerships, they go back a very long way, and it's going to take quite a long time to resolve. But there's an interesting process underway. So, for example, just this year, the French Foreign Ministry, it's created a special. There's a series of entrance exams, if you like, to join the Foreign Service in France. And they have just created a new one, specially to train people who wish to become specialists in Africa. And one of the elements, optional elements in the exam, is to strengthen the option for people to study African languages. I think there are now going to be about 6 African languages as options. So and they're making a big push to recruit young French citizens of families of diaspora origin into the French Foreign Service to become diplomats in the French government who, if they wish, can choose to specialize in Africa. Of course, they may choose to specialize in other parts of the world, China, America, or whatever it is. But so there is quite an effort, and just as that connection between the UK and English-speaking African countries remains so deep and deeply rooted, you only have to look at the English football team and all the players of Nigerian origin and more broadly African origin in the English national football team, or members of the British Parliament of Nigerian family background. The same is true in France. And so that at a people level, the level of people and families and society, those connections are very, very deep, but hopefully they will evolve further in a positive direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If you are joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion, we kindly ask you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel so that our podcast can grow. This video is proudly sponsored by Magnite clothing brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page. Their links are in the description of this video. Mr. Paul, I have a lot of questions, and I think I'd like to ask you maybe if we can do a second part of this discussion, maybe in the future if you have a time. But before I take a leave of you, I'd like to ask you, is there anything that you have expected me to have asked and I didn't ask, and that you can stretch light on that, and then we can call that a day?
I suppose the interesting question that is worth asking for the future is, where are the positive areas where West Africa and countries in the West, but particularly countries in Europe, such as France, can work together? And my quick answer on that would be, you have a look at some of these big issues like climate change and migration, climate change, and also, I think, economic development, because we're seeing, and they are all very closely linked together. And you're right, migration, after all, as I mentioned, Europe and Africa are next to each other. Movements of people between the continents are inevitable, and at the moment, the way European countries manage migration is something that is very felt, creates a lot of resentment and can be very hard faced, and yet they also face all sorts. Politically managing that relationship is difficult, and a much more collaborative management of migration would be really helpful. There's a little example that Spain has just introduced a scheme to allow, I think it's Senegalese, to go to work in Spain as seasonal agricultural workers under a visa scheme for a period. So rather than just trying to stop informal migration, the Spanish government is recognizing that Spanish agriculture and particularly in the south of Spain, where they produce a lot of vegetables for the rest of Europe, and obviously vegetables have to be picked by hand and that sort of thing. They recognizing that Spain and Senegal have a shared interest actually in cooperating on this, and it can benefit Spanish farm owners, but it can benefit Senegalese who get the chance to go and work in Spain and earn some euros. And at one point, France had talked a few years ago, for example, about developing long-term visa arrangements in the recognition that there are people, particularly people who, for example, come and study in Europe for a master's or something like that. They create friendships, they may be offered jobs, they may meet someone and get married, good human connections, and that it would be sensible to offer long-term multiple entry visas. That there are many people who may want to spend a few years in Europe, then they may go back to whichever African country for some time, and then they later may come back to Europe, and that sort of collaborative approach. And then we can see it with climate change. The key breakthroughs on UN climate agreements have often been produced because of a partnership between European countries, the EU, and the African Union, the African bloc, because both continents recognize that this is an issue that has to be faced. And I think one could think more in terms of investment, economic development, conditions, for example, for much more two-way flows of trade and development cooperation, which may be even more needed at a time when many donors, have had to cut back their budgets, like USAID being shut down and so on. So there are many positive areas where West Africa and Europe could collaborate together, and it would be really encouraging, I think, to see much more of that developing over the coming years.
Mr. Melly, thank you so much for being our guest on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It has been an absolute honor to have you share your knowledge with us. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, we encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share our videos. We also encourage you to keep this conversation alive, keep engaged, keep informed, and remain unapologetically African. Until we meet again, shalom